Hello, everyone. Hi, Jeannie. Hi, everyone. Hi, Lila. Thanks for joining us today. My name's Trissa Schaefer, and I work in the Benedictine Institute with Roger Narlock, and we're here today to welcome Jessie Bazan. Jessie graduated from the School of Theology with her Master's of Divinity degree in 2017, and she currently works for the Collegeville Institute. Her work involves 2 grants aimed at helping Christian congregations deepen their sense of calling. She's a regular columnist for U.S. Catholic Magazine and recently published the book Dear Joan Chittister, Conversations with Women in the Church. Jessie is passionate about social justice issues, especially related to women, church life, and young adults. She's excited to talk with us today about Benedictine spirituality and the ways it can be lived out in the workplace in fresh ways. Let's welcome Jessie.
Thanks, Trissa. It's a treat to be here with all of you today. Soon after Dear Joan came out just a couple of weeks ago, my mom mailed me copies of my grandpa's books that he published in the 1960s. Yeah, I was excited to learn that writing about churchy things runs across the generations of our family. And so I was so eager to crack open a book on saints for scouts and saints for servers or altar servers. And right away, I was paging through this Saints for Scouts book, and the dedication caused me to pause. My grandpa dedicated this book to his 3 daughters, one of whom is my mom. And his inscription reads, "This book is affectionately dedicated to Kathy, Patty, and Peggy Flahive, 3 lovable young ladies who will never serve Mass simply because to do so is a man's job." Now, to be very, very clear, my grandpa was an amazing man. He dedicated his life to empowering young people through coaching and teaching and higher education work. He spent most of his life working as an administrator at a small Franciscan college that was actually all women when he started. So he deeply valued and respected women. And I'm confident that if my grandpa were still alive today and able to write a second edition of this book, this would read differently. But this is the church that he knew at that time in the 1960s. His dedication reminds me that we are part of a church, a world, an institution here that is constantly changing and evolving. So in this case, of course, we still celebrate Mass today, right? But in some places, who is able to be an altar server has changed, right? There are women and young girls that serve in this ministry at parishes all over the place. And similarly, I find the Benedictine practices that we hold so dearly root this community and have done so since its founding, and have rooted monastic communities all over the world for 1,500 years, right, since St. Benedict came out of that cave. Listening, hospitality, stewardship, awareness of God. These practices are the good soil from which our life together grows. And what sprouts up looks differently over the years, right? As new people come in and embody the Benedictine way in their own life, in their own way, as the needs shift generationally and the needs of society change. I think of prayer as kind of an easy example of what this looks like. So we know our monks and sisters have prayed the Liturgy of the Hours for decades now in their church and oratory. The same 150 psalms over and over and over. That rhythm of prayer holds steady, always has, and I'm sure always will. But major changes to that prayer practice came in the 1960s when they shifted from praying in Latin to praying in English. So again, the value of prayer didn't change, but the way that it was practiced and embodied did change. And so I think for us as people that work and live in this place, it's valuable to reflect often on how the Benedictine values are being practiced today and how we can draw on these values in our current context as they too continue to change and evolve. To prompt this reflection, I'm going to offer 3 stories from my new book, Dear Joan Chittister, Conversations with Women in the Church. The book is organized as a series of letters back and forth between these lovely young feminist theologians and Sister Joan Chittister, who I imagine doesn't need too much of an introduction in this group. She's a total prophetic force. She's an international best-selling author and speaker who has given her life to preaching about the ways that Benedictine spirituality can inform our daily lives and is a real advocate for social justice and women's roles in the church. So this book came about briefly. All of these co-authors and myself spent 2 weeks, 2 summers ago, with the Benedictine sisters in Erie, taking classes from Joan on Benedictine spirituality through a feminist lens. And it was such a wonderful time of sharing across generations. So we spent time in prayer, sharing meals with sisters that oftentimes were 30, 40, 50 years older than us. They were sitting in on our classes, and we just learned so much from each other. It was, I thought, a great example of what Benedict talks about in the rule of the younger reverencing and listening to the older, and the older listening to and reverencing the younger. And so this book stems from those conversations. These women, most of whom had never set foot in a monastery before our time in Erie, helped me to see how Benedictine spirituality can be embodied in different ways. So their stories and what they shared during our time together helped me wrestle with my understanding of obedience. That listening doesn't always have to mean kind of passively receiving. And the real complexities of hospitality and what that looks like in our workplace and church today. So those will be the 3 values that I'll focus on here: obedience, listening, and hospitality. And my hope is that sharing these stories might prompt you to reflect in your own way how Benedictine practices are being lived out in your area of this community life, and the ways that that plays out in our current context. Okay, obedience first. This is the value that makes me cringe the most, obedience. When I hear obedience, I often think of stories I've heard from older monks of days gone by when they'd walk past the abbot's office and he'd summon them in and here's your one-way ticket to the Bahamas or somewhere else around the world, right? That it was kind of what the abbot or the prioress says goes. There wasn't a lot of conversation. It was a very top-down model of obedience. And to be fair, that model of kind of a top-down hierarchy was what the church was modeled after for many, many years before the Second Vatican Council. But the way that I see Benedictine spirituality being lived out today in terms of obedience is much more relational. I was thinking about it like a wheel with a hub and spokes. Joan uses this image too of God being like the middle part, right? And the rest of us are out there, the spokes, and we're all related to each other through our relationship to God. So it's much more relational focused. And Joan writes that the role of authority in Benedictine spirituality is to unify the community and to direct its attention to God, who is the center of life. Obedience for the sake of obedience can be sheer domination. Benedictine authority is not militaristic. It's designed to call us to our best selves by calling us not to a system, but to a gospel. And getting to this point is hard work. Right? This domination model of obedience is still very much in play in certain workplaces, maybe here, maybe not. An employee, for example, might feel like they have no choice but to kind of submit to whatever their supervisor says if there's kind of an imbalance of power there. Maybe they feel like they're at risk of losing their job if they speak up about something that they see. Right? So they're obedient in the more passive way. And we know that happens in places all over. Discerning what sort of authority to accept and what sort of authority to maybe push back on if an injustice is happening does take real discernment. My co-author, Teresa, wrestled with this issue at a parish where she's employed. A new pastor, new boss for her, came in, and for the first few months of their working relationship, Teresa says that he would groan or sigh every time she asked to meet with him. Every time. It became this cycle. Father, can we have a meeting today? Sure, if we have to. And you can imagine how that affects someone's ego, their sense of worth. She started to question her own worthiness as an employee, as a minister. And it just became this cycle where she just kind of passively accepted this behavior from her supervisor and grew quiet in the process. And then one day, Teresa decided that she had enough. She writes, "Instead of accepting the explanations I was given, I began to ask myself some questions. Am I doing my best to serve this place where we both work? Am I entitled to my boss's input and advice? Am I worthy of his time? As I answered yes to each of these questions, further questions emerged. Why am I allowing myself to be treated in a way I would never accept from a friend, a parent, my husband, or a different coworker? Can I speak up to my boss?" From these questions, another one bubbled up. "Is everything all right?" I asked my priest as he sighed loudly during a check-in meeting I scheduled. "Oh yes, it's fine," he quickly replied. "You're sighing. You seem either bored or upset. Are you?" I pushed on. As I waited for his reply to my quiet but direct question, he grew momentarily flustered, and then, like flipping a switch, his countenance changed. He sat up straighter and gave me his full attention, and we had the most fruitful conversation we had ever had. Teresa says that moment transformed their working relationship. And so returning to Joan's insight that obedience is designed to call us to our best selves by calling us not to a system, but to the gospel. So Teresa believed in her own gifts as an employee, as a minister, enough to stop blindly obeying her boss in this troublesome situation. Now, to be clear, she did take a risk here. This is a young lay woman speaking up to an older ordained man. So there's definitely multiple levels of power differential that she was dealing with. But in speaking up, I think Teresa offers a great example for us of how to live into this more relational model of obedience that's really at the heart of Benedictine spirituality, by speaking up, by being honest, and being in conversation with each other. So some questions that perhaps to consider. How do you practice obedience in the workplace? And does your practice of obedience look different today than when you first started in your work? Listening. So in many ways, I think listening and obedience really go hand in hand. Each can be practiced in a more top-down model that feels more one-sided. But that's not the kind of listening that we're called to do in a Benedictine place. St. Benedict calls monastics, we know in the beginning of the rule, to listen with the ear of your heart. And that's listening to Scripture, to community, to the rule itself, and to the needs of the world. So This Benedictine way of listening invites us to seep in the wisdom of the world around us, to let it touch the very core of our being, our hearts, and then to be open to the transformation that such deep listening can elicit in us. Later in the prologue, Benedict writes, "Now that we have asked God, heard or listened to instructions, we must run and do what will profit us forever." So he's saying we're not the same after we listen deeply. Benedictine listening provokes a response. And now, certainly, both men and women, monastics, we know, have engaged this more active listening across generations. But I'd like to focus on the women for a minute, because spending time with Joan and the Benedictine Sisters of Erie, as well as time down the road at St. Ben's Monastery, has given me a profound appreciation for the courage that it takes women, and especially women religious, who for generations have been listening closely and then responding unapologetically at times when women were not supposed to be so bold. And this is something that I know I can take for granted at times as a 28-year-old who grew up seeing women running for political office, or many women going to college, or taking leadership positions in the workplace. We know, obviously, the world's not like a peachy great place for women all over the place, but I still know that I have opportunities today that weren't afforded to many women 70 years ago, 50 years ago, even 20 years ago. And I have those opportunities in large part because of the braveness of older generations of women who paved the way, and with ways that they listened with the ears of their heart and then did what needed to be done. And it's a real honor, I think, to stand on their shoulders and to be doing this ministry work today. And this sort of active listening is crucial, we all know, in the workplace today. In Dear Joan, one of the co-authors, Jackie, offers a great example of observing an older sister listen to the world around her and then take action because of it. And this situation that she describes, I'm sure and no doubt, plays out in different ways across our workplace. The context of her story is a march, kind of a protest, but again, I can see this happening walking down the hallway, right? So Jackie and Sister Mary Lou attended a political demonstration in Erie a few years back. That's the Erie Benedictine way to go to demonstrations. And they were standing on the street when a female politician walked by, who Jackie learned later had taken some pretty controversial stances throughout her career. And the man who was standing behind Jackie and Mary Lou, as soon as this woman walked by, just started yelling these vile, sexist remarks at her, just yelling, to no one in particular, but wanting to make sure that everyone could hear him. And Jackie says in that moment she froze. She was trying to think through some sort of well-reasoned argument for why this man should stop, when suddenly Mary Lou turned around to this man and with a tight jaw said, "Hey, that's my friend you're talking about." And the man's face flushed red, and he stammered, "Oh, I'm so sorry." Jackie writes, "I don't think shocked is too strong a word to describe how I felt in that moment. Mary Lou had overturned all my assumptions about how best to challenge bigotry and bullying by aligning herself unapologetically and unpretentiously with the person the man was criticizing. She showed me that speaking up does not need to be an academic exercise. Sometimes, speaking up can be a matter of reminding those in power that victims of injustice are human beings too, and are part of our community, loved and worthy of love. Has anyone ever heard a colleague talk smack about another colleague? Right? This happens. It happens in different places. We're human beings. And bullying doesn't always happen in this public of a way. But I think Mary Lou showed Jackie the way that Benedictine listening is lived out in action. So she paid attention to what was happening, and then she did something about it. As simple as that. And sometimes not as simple as that. Right? So I'd invite you to consider, how do you typically practice listening in the workplace? And is there an area of your work life that maybe could use a little more active listening? And then lastly, I'll dive into one of the more popular Benedictine practices, hospitality. So Benedict writes in chapter 53 of his rule that monastics are to receive all guests as Christ. All guests. Benedict doesn't make any provisions. Everyone who walks through the door, young, old, poor, pilgrim, family, everyone is to be embraced with a warmth that says, you matter. You matter. And we know from being in this place that that commitment to hospitality has certainly not changed over the years. What has changed, though, are the demographics and the makeup of the people who walk through these doors. Right? It's not a secret that this is not an exclusively white, German, male community anymore. We're becoming more and more diverse as a community each day. I mean, I was thinking just of the student body as an example. The number of openly gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual students has greatly increased just over the last 5 or 10 years. The ways that improvements in travel technology have made it possible for people from around the world, different places and cultures, to study here has been quite incredible. I saw a statistic from Give SOT Day last week that there's one class at the SOT that has students from 5 different continents in it. I mean, that's incredible. We think about the rise in mental health and disability advocacy more broadly. Nearly half of college students report a mental health issue. So when we think about, given this changing context, what does it look like to practice hospitality, to receive all as Christ in 2019? Well, it probably looks like receiving a Christ who has darker skin, maybe differently abled or gender fluid, whose passport might not say United States, whose bank account might not have much in it. And it makes sense then that the ways that we practice hospitality would expand to encompass the growing diversity in our community. So I have one more example from Dear Joan of a Catholic institution that did not practice hospitality, to Megan, one of our co-authors. And this is a dramatic example. I hope, and I'm pretty confident that this wouldn't happen here, but I share this just as an example to help us evaluate our own hospitality practices in the workplace. So Megan was a graduate student at a seminary in Buffalo a few years back when she fell ill. And in the span of 4 months, she completely lost her hearing. She became profoundly deaf. And the illness, while it took her hearing, it did not take at all her determination to serve the church and continue with her ministry work. And Megan is brilliant, one of the most brilliant people I've met, and was determined to finish her schooling. But her seminary professors and some classmates had other ideas. Megan writes towards the end of the book about a night where she received an email from her professor telling her that she was pointless, useless, and worthless. She says those in power bemoaned any change to the status quo that would provide some sort of accessibility, writing, accommodations in the classroom were denied and removed at the whim of professors who found a smart, deaf woman at a Catholic seminary a threat. Now, to Megan's credit, she showed up to class the next day, graduated, and is really using this sort of bullying as a motivation to go on and get her PhD and try to be the change that she wants to see in the church. And she has a letter of recommendation from Joan Chittister, which doesn't hurt. But her again, it's an extreme example, it's an awful example, but it raises for me questions about how institutions, maybe like ours, adapt hospitality practices to fit real needs. It makes me wonder what sort of structural changes might need to happen in order to practice hospitality. And if communities are really willing to stretch to truly receive all as Christ. So when we think about hospitality, I've asked that first question to a couple of sisters I saw on Sunday, and I loved hearing their answers. The ways that the community that they've seen has shifted and changed since they came here years and years ago. And then how the growing diversity of our community may be inviting or challenging us to practice hospitality in new ways. So there are many ways that we can become Benedictine across generations, from the youngest on up. This here is little Esther, whose mom, Teresa, was the woman I referenced earlier who helped write this book. Practices like obedience, listening, and hospitality are dynamic practices that we live into in different ways during our time here. And we certainly can't imagine what the needs of this community will be 18 years from now when Esther's a Benny in the class of 2040. But by continuing to stay rooted in our core Benedictine practices and reflective of the evolving ways we're being called to embody Benedictine spirituality, I think our community should be in a good place for years to come. Thank you. Sure. Yeah. I would welcome any questions, rebuttals, your own experiences of community, listening, obedience, anything like that. There's a microphone here. Throwing a bone. Nice.
Thank you, Jessie. Could you say a little bit about you don't have to get into maybe as personal of scenarios as you did for some of your co-authors, but what motivated you to write this kind of book or to put together this kind of book?
I found in the community of women gathered in Erie a community of peers that I hadn't experienced before, partly the ways I did or didn't branch out during my time here, but to be around other young women in ministry, a very particular context that we share, it was so life-giving and really necessary to do this work, to have others that we could share when it was a tough day, we can text back and forth, or when something really exciting happens, and they just get it. They get it in a way. And so as the time in Erie was coming to a close, I thought really intentionally about how we could keep those sorts of conversations going and even expand the circle beyond just our group of co-authors. But we thought there are so many other, in this case, women in ministry that I think need support and need to know that they're heard and valued. And so that was our hope for this book, is that it would spark conversations among others about their own experiences and stories. Great. Well, I appreciate your time today, and maybe Trissa has some announcements. Roger does? Great.
Thank you so much, Jessie. I'm Roger Narlock, director of the Benedictine Institute, and in addition to thanking Jessie, I just wanted to remind you of a couple of things we have left going on this semester for the Benedictine Institute. In addition to our weekly Lectio in the library on both campuses, as well as our building community events, which are on Friday mornings, and you're all welcome to come for no agenda community building opportunity around some free goodies and coffee. In addition to those things, look at the week after you get back from Thanksgiving, and we have a couple of special events going then. The Monday of that first day back after Thanksgiving at 4 o'clock, we will have a tree lighting ceremony in the Great Hall, and there will be Christmas cookies and hot chocolate, and Father Robert Koopman will be playing the piano and leading us in Christmas carols. So join us for that at 4 o'clock on Monday after Thanksgiving. On Thursday after Thanksgiving at 3 o'clock, we will have another of our events in regard to doing audio divina, and this will be in Emmaus Chapel in the School of Theology. And we're partnering with Fine Arts Programming, who is bringing in Cherish the Ladies, and they will be, in addition to their performance at St. Ben's, they will be providing live music during Audio Divina, and will walk us through the steps in reflecting on the music, and sort of there will be a little bit of time for sharing, although it'll be optional sharing, so you can take a moment out of your day and participate in this wonderful offshoot of Lectio Divina. So with that, I hope you enjoyed the presentation today and the great food. We have one question in back.
Roger, where'd Jessie go? There you are. Oh, I see you. Jessie, your questions about each of the values that you addressed today are meant for us to really reflect. Would you be willing to have Roger or Tris or someone send those out so that we don't lose track of those? Because I think they're really valuable, and we should be not taking them in right now and then going back off to forget about them, but taking them in and remembering them and keeping them in front of us.
Yeah, thanks, Howard. Yeah, that was very quick. I think that is Father Renee set a nice precedent last time when he sent out his materials afterwards. So yeah, I'd be glad to share those with Trissa and send it to you all.
Wonderful. And as is the case from the Benedictine perspective, and with lots of the programming that we try to do, is these aren't just big splashes that you have once a semester, but they are meant to be incorporated into your daily activity. It's not just a special event, it's the way in which we see the world around us on a day-to-day basis in a special way. And questions like Jessie's really help us to do that. So have a good rest of the day, and I'll get the, one more? Oh. Thank you. If you want to look at or purchase Jessie's book, Anne from the library has a table in the back, and you may do so right now. There's also some books by Sister Joan Chittister back there as well. So have a wonderful day.